In 1930, the United States Congress passed a law. It had a simple premise: protect American workers, protect American industry, keep foreign goods out. Within 3 years, global trade had collapsed by 66%. Over 10,000 American businesses had failed. Unemployment had climbed from 3% to 25%. The law was called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and the men who built it were not acting out of ignorance. They were acting out of certainty. That's the part nobody talks about. To understand what happened, you have to go back before the crash. Before October 1929. Before the ticker tape stopped making sense. American farmers had been bleeding for nearly a decade. After the First World War ended, European agriculture recovered. Global crop prices fell. And American farmers, who had borrowed against their land to buy machinery, to plant more, to produce more, found themselves selling at prices that couldn't cover the debt. Picture the American Midwest in the mid-1920s. Fields of wheat no one will buy at the price it costs to grow. Grain elevators full. Banks sending letters. The land that families had broken their backs to own, quietly slipping away. This was the pressure that 2 men in Washington decided to solve. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah, Congressman Willis Hawley of Oregon. Both powerful, both Republican, both completely convinced they were right. The original proposal was narrow: raise tariffs on agricultural imports, give American farmers a price floor. That version might have been containable. But Washington doesn't work in narrow proposals. Every industry with a lobbyist and a sympathetic congressman wanted protection. Steel, textiles, chemicals, shoes, lumber. One by one, tariff schedules were added, rates were padded, and a bill that had started as agricultural relief transformed into something else entirely. By the time it reached a vote, it covered over 20,000 imported goods. It was no longer a farm bill. It was a wall. In May of 1930, over 1,000 economists signed an open letter to President Herbert Hoover. 1,000. They warned him directly. This will raise prices for American consumers, invite retaliation from trading partners, and ultimately damage the very industries it claims to protect. Hoover had doubts. He'd said so privately. But the political machinery had been running too long to stop. The lobbying was too deep. The party platform too committed. And Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary, one of the wealthiest industrialists in America, was pushing forward. On June 17, 1930, Hoover signed it. If that already feels familiar, stay with this. The response from the rest of the world was not slow. It was not diplomatic. It was immediate. Canada moved within weeks. Then Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Switzerland, which exported precision watches and fine textiles into American markets, organized a consumer boycott of American goods. 25 countries raised barriers against American exports before the end of the year. Now picture the ports. Ships sitting at dock with cargo that no longer has a buyer at the price it was loaded for. Warehouses filling with unsold American grain, American steel, American cotton. The trade routes that had carried goods across the Atlantic for decades went quiet. American exports fell from roughly $5.5 billion in 1929 to around $2 billion by 1932. The wall they built to keep foreign goods out had also locked American goods in. The farmers Smoot and Hawley were trying to save couldn't sell wheat to Europe anymore. There was no market left to sell into. Here is where the story turns darker. What Smoot-Hawley did was eliminate the escape routes. European nations were already under strain, carrying debt from the First World War, much of it owed to American banks. Their ability to service that debt depended entirely on their ability to export goods into the United States and earn American dollars. Smoot-Hawley shut that channel. And when the dollars stopped flowing, the debt payments stopped too. Banks began to fail, not quietly. In Austria, one of the largest banks on the continent, Kreditanstalt, collapsed in 1931, triggering a cascade through European financial systems that would take years to unwind. American banks had loaned heavily into those same markets. When the collateral evaporated, the losses came home. And then came the lines. Long, quiet lines of people outside banks that would never reopen. Lines outside employment offices with no work to offer. Lines at soup kitchens that stretched around the block in cities that, 2 years earlier, had been booming. One law, one signature, a thread pulled through the center of the global financial system. Tariffs sound simple. A tax on foreign goods, a price advantage for domestic producers. But in an interconnected economy, nothing is only what it sounds like. When you raise the price of imported steel, every American manufacturer who uses steel as an input sees their costs climb. When you raise the price of imported textiles and leather and rubber, the cost of ordinary life rises for workers whose wages have not moved. The factory owner and the family buying shoes are squeezed from the same direction. Demand contracted. Orders dried up. Businesses that had been surviving on thin margins faced rising costs and falling customers at the same time. When you raise tariffs broadly enough, you don't protect the economy. You tax it. The 1,000 economists who signed that letter understood this. The men who signed the bill into law were told. The record is clear on that point. Consider what it looked like on the ground. A factory in Ohio that had been running 3 shifts goes to 2, then 1, then dark. The men who worked there don't receive an explanation. They receive a last envelope. A farm in Kansas that had survived drought and low prices finally meets the debt it cannot outrun. The bank takes the land. The family loads what fits in a truck and drives west into nothing. A hardware store in a small Pennsylvania town loses its wholesale suppliers, then its customers, then its lease. The owner has never heard of Reed Smoot or Willis Hawley. He just knows the shelves are empty and the rent is due. This is what systemic collapse actually looks like. Not a single dramatic event. Thousands of small closings spread across years, invisible in aggregate, until the aggregate becomes undeniable. Smoot and Hawley both lost their seats in 1932. The electorate delivered its verdict. Hoover lost to Roosevelt in a landslide. But the law stayed. Its rates were only meaningfully rolled back when Roosevelt signed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act in 1934, 4 years after the damage had begun, and years into the Depression. The architects walked away. Smoot returned to Utah. Hawley went back to practicing law. Mellon resigned as Treasury Secretary and was appointed ambassador to Britain. one of the most prestigious postings in American diplomacy. None of them stood in the lines they had helped create. None of them lost a farm, or a factory, or a lifetime of savings. That, too, is part of the pattern. Here is what the historical record shows, cleanly. When a domestic political problem becomes urgent enough, the instinct is to reach for a visible, symbolic solution. Something that can be announced, something that sounds strong. Tariffs fill that role almost perfectly. They're legible, enforceable. They carry the feeling of action. And their damage is distributed across time and across actors in ways that make attribution nearly impossible. The factory that closes doesn't close with a sign naming the cause. It just closes. The farmer who loses a market doesn't receive an explanation. He just loses. The mechanism was understood before it was deployed. That's the part that should give you pause. This is the part most people never question. We are, right now, inside a tariff moment. The framing is recognizable. Protect domestic industry. Correct unfair trade practices. Bring manufacturing home. The specific targets are different. The global architecture is different. But the mechanism is the same, and so is the response. Retaliation has already begun. American agricultural exporters are navigating new barriers. Input costs for manufacturers are climbing. Trading relationships built over decades are under renegotiation or strain. Whether this ends the same way depends on variables no single actor controls. But the structure, the incentives, the political pressures, the way pain distributes itself invisibly across millions of individual decisions, maps closely onto what happened in 1930. Serious economists are not dismissing the comparison. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with uncomfortable precision. What Smoot-Hawley revealed was not just a policy failure. It revealed how a system that connects everything – trade, credit, employment, savings – can be destabilized by people who are insulated from the consequences of their own decisions. The men who built the wall did not live behind it. They made the decision. They signed the papers. They moved on. The people who paid were the ones who had no seat at the table. The farmers, the factory workers, the depositors who arrived at their bank one morning and found a notice on the door. This is not unique to 1930. It is the structure underneath most economic disasters. Decisions get made at one altitude. The consequences land at another. And the distance between those two altitudes is never an accident. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was eventually dismantled. The global trading system was rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, through institutions designed specifically to prevent what 1930 had made possible. The men who built those post-war institutions had lived through the collapse. Some of them had watched it happen in real time. They understood, at a level that was not abstract, what economic nationalism pursued hard enough actually produces. Not strength, isolation, then contraction, then collapse. They built an entire world order around never letting it happen again. Those institutions are now under more pressure than they have faced in decades. The agreements are being renegotiated. The architecture is shifting. It's worth asking what we're building now, and who benefits from the answer. If this made you look at things differently, I'm curious what you think.